Sensational. Washington's multi-step strategy that finished off the Kremlin. Marco Rubio and JD Vance completely convinced Trump and secured total support for Ukraine. Putin has no more chances left. How the young circle around the American leader proved that the only bet should be on Kyiv's victory. The result is powerful, a green light for strikes on Russia and a historic license to produce patriots. And what's more, Trump has already chosen his successor. The stakes are very high. Who does the main Republican want to see in his place? All the details of the behind-the-scenes revolution and more, right now. Welcome. My name is Andrei Silikov and this is the channel Ukraine Today. Let's discuss the latest news. The current tectonic shift in American politics and Donald Trump's unexpectedly warm words toward Ukraine are not just a random change in mood. Behind this is the colossal systematic work of a new generation of the Republican elite who are now shaping the agenda in the White House. Pragmatic heavyweights like Marco Rubio and JD Vance have managed to completely change Trump's perspective on this war. They played on his main quality. Trump loves winners and despises losers. By showing the boss Ukraine's real successes, long-range strikes on Russia, the blockade of Crimea, and the technological superiority of the Ukrainian armed forces in the sky, they firmly tied Ukraine's image to success, which Trump now wants to share in.
I know that Zelensky will build a great and strong country.
The key role in destroying the Kremlin's illusions was played by the new US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. It was he who became the architect of Washington's new tough stance on strikes deep inside the Russian Federation. At the meeting in Ankara, Rubio publicly took the initiative, declaring that America would systematically help Ukraine set fire to targets on Russian territory so that Moscow would finally realize the complete vulnerability of its airspace. Rubio masterfully reframed this issue for Trump. He presented deep strikes on Russian oil refineries and airfields not as a dangerous escalation, but as the most effective tool to force Putin into real, not sham, negotiations.
We will actively support and assist Ukraine to carry out strikes deep inside Russia, to bring this ongoing conflict to a definitive conclusion. We are currently engaged in serious discussions regarding the potential for Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory, so that Russia can see exactly how extremely challenging and complex it is to defend its own airspace.
Vice President JD Vance, whom Trump has already officially designated as his successor and the future leader of the Republican Party, has had no less of a powerful influence on the president's position. Vance, backed by billions from Silicon Valley and the powerful MAGA movement, shifted the discussion about Ukraine into the language of business and strategic advantage. His team proved to Trump that a country spending 63% of its budget on defense and possessing the most capable army in Europe is an invaluable defense asset for the United States. Vance used figures to demonstrate that isolating Kiev would deal a devastating blow to America's own authority.
This approach has yielded much better results, since it is easier to defend than to attack. It allowed the Ukrainians to use their tactical advantage more effectively. Frankly speaking, Russia is now in a situation where its potential for further offensive operations is rapidly diminishing and is approaching almost zero. Russia is paying an extremely high price for every square kilometer of captured territory.
The result of this intellectual brainstorming within Trump's team was a decision that threw the Kremlin into a state of fury. Persuaded by his advisors, Trump personally announced the transfer to Ukraine of a license for domestic production of Patriot air defense missile systems. Trump's team had carefully calculated this move. Ukraine's access to American military technologies on such a scale will forever eliminate ballistic blackmail from Moscow. Rubio and Vance pushed Trump to act preemptively in order to thwart Putin's plan, which was to wage a war of attrition for years.
A little bird told me that we will give the Ukrainians the right to produce Patriots. We will show them how to make them. Ukraine will manufacture air defense missiles for the Patriot system. We need Patriots too, but I think the Ukrainians will be able to start production very quickly once we explain everything to them.
The way Trump's own rhetoric has changed clearly demonstrates that junior politicians have a considerable degree of control over the White House's foreign policy course. Interrupting Rubio at the press conference, Trump, without hesitation, repeated the talking points of his Secretary of State, calling strikes on Russian territory the right kind of escalation that would lead to the end of the war.
It's an escalation, but it's an escalation that could help bring about an end.
All of the Kremlin elite's hopes that Trump would come and simply cut off Kiev's oxygen have been reduced to nothing. This is an absolute defeat for Russian diplomacy and a personal triumph for Volodymyr Zelensky, who has found perfect mutual understanding with the young White House team, securing a pro-Ukrainian course for the United States for years to come through Rubio and Vance. Kiev has effectively deprived the Kremlin of even the slightest room for maneuver in geopolitics. While Putin frantically strengthens his personal security in the bunker, the American elites have already outlined the scenario of his inevitable end, in which Ukraine is assigned the role of main victor and key architect of the security of a new Europe. A signal has come from America that has become a real cold shower for Putin. In Washington, there is increasingly loud talk about the unprecedented strengthening of Ukraine and steps that just yesterday seemed absolutely impossible. American officials are now openly giving a truly devastating assessment of Russia's depleted army, completely nullifying the Kremlin's offensive plans. Why was the main blow to Moscow's plans conceived on the other side of the Atlantic? And what unpleasant surprises Putin should start preparing for, you'll find out in our report. America's formidable fist has struck Putin. The Kremlin has started to catch on. Their hopes for Trump may collapse even faster than Russia's promises to take Ukraine in 3 days. After another phone conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, people in Moscow suddenly started talking as if they had lost their last diplomatic lifeline. The hysteria in the Russian information space is only gaining momentum. But the most interesting things are happening behind the scenes. Russian commentators and Kremlin-affiliated experts are increasingly openly complaining that Trump may turn out to be nothing like the ally they were counting on. Russian circles already understand. After the NATO summit, Washington is shifting to a much tougher stance toward Moscow. For years, Russian propaganda has been convincing its audience that as soon as the occupant of the White House changes, the West will immediately start taking the Kremlin's interests into account. But now a very different idea is being voiced more and more often in Moscow. It seems that Washington is starting to lose patience with the endless Kremlin ultimatums and attempts to drag out the war. That is why the nervousness in Moscow is becoming increasingly noticeable. After all, if even in the United States there is growing talk about the need to put pressure on Russia and the expected mutual understanding with Washington has not materialized, then the Kremlin is facing a very unpleasant prospect. It turns out that Putin's main problem may not only be Ukraine on the battlefield, but also the fact that his diplomatic game is starting to fall apart on all fronts at once. And it seems that the Kremlin has fewer and fewer reasons for optimism. At the NATO summit in Turkey, one of the main topics during the talks between Trump and Zelensky was ending the war. And this is a very telling signal. While Moscow continues to repeat its old ultimatums, Washington is increasingly working with Kiev to find a formula for peace. Ukraine's role in international negotiations is only growing stronger, while the Kremlin is gradually losing its ability to impose its own agenda. Moreover, Washington is announcing new defense agreements worth billions of dollars and is urging its allies to increase military spending. In other words, while the Kremlin dreams of Western fatigue, the alliance is discussing new ways to strengthen its own defense and support its partners. And if this trend continues, truly dangerous times are coming for Putin. While the Kremlin still clings to memories of being able to talk to the West in the language of blackmail and threats, in Washington, there is increasing talk of ending the war from a position of strength. And then it may turn out that the main blow to the Kremlin's plans did not come from the front, but from NATO's negotiating rooms, where Russia is increasingly seen as a player incapable of dictating the rules. And even that is not all. In the United States, there is talk of a move that Moscow, just a few years ago, considered absolutely impossible. Donald Trump has allowed for the possibility of granting licenses to produce American weapons not only in Europe, but directly in Ukraine as well. And if this decision is implemented, it could become a real nightmare for Russian strategists. In fact, this is a scenario in which Ukraine would gradually receive not only finished weaponry, but also the ability to independently produce some of the most important systems. This is especially important against the backdrop of Russia's constant ballistic missile attacks. After all, one of the main objectives is to increase the production of interceptor missiles for air defense systems. Trump himself confirmed that this idea is indeed being considered.
They would like to do this. We will consider this issue.
Germany's position sounded even more interesting. Chancellor Friedrich Merz essentially acknowledged what the military has been saying for a long time. The current volume of arms production in the West is insufficient.
We are all currently confronted with the significant challenge that we are producing an insufficient amount of goods. This shortfall can be effectively compensated by granting strategic licenses to highly capable companies that possess the necessary production capacities. Among these organizations are both established European firms and various Ukrainian companies.
For the Kremlin, there is a particularly unpleasant detail hidden here. The Russian strategy was largely based on the assumption that Ukraine would be dependent on external supplies and that any delays in aid would automatically weaken its defense. But if American technologies begin to be produced closer to the front and some of the weapons are manufactured in Ukraine, this logic starts to fall apart right before our eyes. Vladimir Zelensky also openly speaks about the importance of such a decision.
Production in the US is not as large as our needs. We need licenses. When President Trump is positive, I hope that means yes.
And if this plan gets the green light, it could be a much more painful blow for Moscow than another aid package. Because missiles run out, warehouses are emptied, but established production keeps working for years. And then Russia will have to deal not just with deliveries of Western weapons, but with Ukraine's ever-growing defense potential, which will become increasingly difficult to stop, even with all the Kremlin's resources. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance added fuel to the fire. He stated that Russia's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations has now become negligible and is practically approaching zero. This sounds especially painful for a country that, for the 5th year in a row, has been trying to convince the world of its inexhaustible military might. According to Vance, Ukraine's strategy of wearing down the enemy has started to yield results. While the Russian army tries to claw out a few more kilometers at the front, it is paying an ever higher price for it. And today, the Kremlin's main achievement is not conquered territories, but record numbers of lost equipment and personnel. Washington has effectively admitted Russia has fallen into its own trap. Each new assault costs the occupiers so much that even formal advances are looking less and less like military success. A paradoxical situation is emerging. The map may change by a few hundred meters, while the number of casualties reaches into the thousands. And if these estimates are accurate, then this is truly an alarming signal for the Kremlin. After all, even when Washington says that Russia's offensive capabilities are almost exhausted, it means only one thing. Despite all the loud statements and the maps drawn for Putin, the real situation at the front is looking less and less like a story of a Russian offensive and more like a story of the slow depletion of an army that is no longer able to achieve its goals. The end of the war is closer than it seems. Kirill Budanov has stated that there is a real chance to finally force Russia to capitulate as early as this year. While the production of Ukrainian long-range weaponry is completely rewriting the rules of the game, Western analysts are noting the total collapse of the Kremlin's strategy. The situation has gone so far that even reputable global media have finally buried any belief in Moscow's victory. See right now exactly how our soldiers are currently finishing off the aggressor's war machine.
Has the war really started moving toward its conclusion? Kirill Budanov's statement has sparked discussions about what until recently seemed unattainable. There are real chances for the war to end as early as this year. According to the head of the president's office, such chances do exist. And although the world is currently witnessing a new round of escalation, it may actually become the precondition for future de-escalation and a return to negotiations. It sounds paradoxical, but the history of wars has proven more than once. Very often, the sides only start seeking compromises after they realize that achieving their goals by force is impossible. And it seems that this logic is well understood in Kyiv. While the Kremlin continues to speak in the language of ultimatums, Ukraine is ramping up what is increasingly being called its main trump card, namely, the production of its own long-range strike capabilities. Budanov openly admitted, the scale of Ukrainian production has already reached a level that allows for a significant increase in the intensity of strikes on Russian territory. This means that for Moscow, the war is becoming increasingly costly not only at the front, but also deep in the rear.
The volume of our own production has already become, let's say, respectable, which allows us to increase the intensity, and that intensity makes it possible to achieve certain results.
It is precisely here that a scenario begins to take shape, one that military analysts are talking about more and more often. While the Russian army is trying to advance, Ukraine is striking at what no army in the world can function without: logistics. Warehouses, supply routes, fuel infrastructure, transportation hubs. The goal is simple: to make supplying the front so complicated and expensive that every new offensive turns into an exhausting gamble for the Kremlin. The very factors that Moscow considered secondary just yesterday may now determine the outcome of the war. While Russian propaganda counts square kilometers on the map, the Ukrainian strategy is increasingly focused on depleting the enemy's resources. And if this trend continues, the moment when the Kremlin itself is forced to seriously consider dialogue may come much sooner than many expect. That is why the main question now is, what will be the real path to peace? Kyiv makes it clear, not through concessions and not by freezing the problem, but by creating conditions in which continuing the war becomes too costly and futile for Russia. If Budanov's assessments prove correct, then the first real outlines of a future peace may appear precisely after the Kremlin is finally convinced that time is no longer on its side. The inevitability of Russia's defeat is being discussed outside of Ukraine as well. The influential Western publication Bloomberg essentially acknowledges that the prospect of Russia winning the war against Ukraine no longer seems realistic. And this is no longer the assessment of Ukrainian officials or military experts from Kyiv. Such signals are increasingly coming from leading global analytical centers, where they closely monitor developments at the front and the state of the Russian economy. Just a few years ago, the Kremlin was counting on a completely different scenario, but today even Western observers are noting that Russia's last major offensive has essentially stalled, and the cost of every new kilometer of the front for Moscow continues to rise rapidly. Human losses, production problems, labor shortages, and increasing pressure on the economy are creating a situation for the Kremlin that is becoming difficult to conceal even behind the loudest propaganda slogans. Moreover, Ukrainian drones and missiles are increasingly reaching oil refineries, energy hubs, logistics centers, and military facilities inside Russia itself. What was once considered an inviolable rear is gradually turning into a territory of constant risks. According to many analysts, this is precisely what makes continuing the war much more costly for the Kremlin than before. Around the world, the conversation is increasingly not about whether Russia can win, but about how and when it will be forced to agree to a cessation of hostilities. Such a shift in rhetoric speaks volumes. Whereas previously discussions revolved around the possible success of the Russian offensive, now increasing attention is being paid to scenarios for a truce and finding a way out of the war. Moreover, in the West, there is now open discussion not only about new aid packages for Ukraine, but also about long-term solutions that could ultimately change the balance of power. Among these are the strengthening of sanctions, increased deliveries of long-range weaponry, new air defense systems, and even the possibility of producing certain defense systems directly in Ukraine. In other words, partners are increasingly preparing not for a compromise on the Kremlin's terms, but for a scenario in which Russia will have to accept new rules of the game. The outlook for Moscow appears extremely unpleasant. The war, which the Kremlin had planned to finish in a matter of days, has gradually turned into a grueling conflict where time, resources, and international support are not working in Russia's favor. That is why more and more experts around the world are hinting the moment when the Kremlin's defeat becomes obvious to everyone may be much closer than it seems today. And for Russia, this means only one thing: its room for maneuver continues to shrink rapidly.
Meanwhile, Crimea is plunging into panic and actively preparing for disaster. Secret orders to security forces, destroyed logistics, and a feverish fear of scenarios that just yesterday seemed unreal. Putin's main sacred trophy has turned into a suitcase without a handle, which is becoming mortally dangerous for the Kremlin to hold onto. Has Moscow started preparing an emergency plan to surrender Crimea? Find out right now.
Crimea on the way out. Very alarming forecasts have suddenly begun to appear in the occupation administrations of the peninsula. According to underground sources, officials in Kerch and Feodosia received an urgent order. By a certain date, they must remove the most valuable documents, archives, and equipment. Russia was planning to stay on the peninsula forever. So why the rush to pack up folders, servers, and office equipment? The most interesting thing is that after this order appeared, a real epidemic of strange illnesses broke out among certain officials. People who just yesterday were actively running the occupation structures suddenly started taking sick leave, going on vacation, and leaving Crimea as quickly as possible. And not just anywhere, but specifically toward the Krasnodar region. All of this is very reminiscent of a familiar scenario. First, the authorities talk about having full control over the situation, then they switch their headquarters to round-the-clock operations, after which they start removing documents and looking for backup escape routes. And then it usually turns out that the situation is not as stable as they claimed on television. These events look especially tense against the backdrop of regular strikes on military targets in Crimea. It seems that even the local collaborators no longer have much faith in the supposedly all-powerful Russian air defense. After a series of Ukrainian strikes on logistics in the south, Russia has faced a new problem. Delivering cargo to the occupied peninsula has not just become difficult, it has become extremely expensive. According to journalists, transporting cargo to Crimea now costs several times more than covering a similar distance within Russia itself. But for the occupiers, the worst part isn't even the prices, but the attitudes of the carriers. More and more drivers are simply refusing to travel the Crimean routes. Some companies are reducing the number of trips, while others are shutting down this route altogether. The reason is simple: everyone wants to make money, but fewer and fewer are willing to become the next target along the way. And while Crimean officials are packing up their documents, Russian military forces have suddenly started practicing a very interesting scenario. According to the exercise scenario, Russian troops were preparing for a landing of Ukrainian forces in Crimea. Moreover, the scenario was so serious that, on the maps, Ukrainian forces were advancing from several directions across the Black Sea at once. They actively used naval drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, long-range weapons, and modern reconnaissance systems. In other words, the occupiers were modeling exactly the course of events that, until recently, Russian propaganda had called completely unrealistic. Notably, in these exercises, the Russian command posts acted mainly from a defensive position. They did not plan a new offensive, did not draw arrows toward Odessa or Mykolaiv, and did not prepare for another push to the west. Instead, they built defensive lines around Sevastopol, Kerch, and northern Crimea. It seems that in the Kremlin, they are increasingly thinking not about how to seize new territories, but about how to hold on to what is still under their control. And while Russian military forces are repelling imaginary Ukrainian landings on their maps, reality is presenting them with a very real problem: the electricity is disappearing. After strikes on key substations, part of the occupied Crimea was suddenly plunged into darkness. Entire districts of the peninsula were left without power. Important nodes of the power system, which supply a significant part of the peninsula, were hit. As a result, problems arose simultaneously in several cities and districts, and this once again demonstrates the main weakness of the occupation model. Crimea appears stable only as long as its infrastructure operates without interruption. If just a few key elements are disabled, the entire system starts to fail. What's most interesting is that the problems weren't limited to electricity. Along with it, the internet also began to disappear. Local residents report disruptions in the operation of services, stores, and order pickup points. And while Kremlin officials talk about the full integration of Crimea into Russia, the peninsula increasingly resembles a remote outpost living in a state of constant emergencies and restrictions. All the recent events suddenly come together to form a single picture. First, there were strikes on logistics and a sharp increase in transportation costs to the peninsula, then orders to evacuate documents from the occupation administrations, followed by transferring headquarters to heightened alert, and now drills to repel a Ukrainian landing. If you look at all this separately, you might call it a coincidence. But when there are too many such coincidences, they start to look like preparations for a very specific scenario. It seems that Moscow's greatest fear today is not just about strikes on military targets. The main threat for the Kremlin is the prospect that Crimea is gradually losing its connection to Russian logistics and will turn into an isolated bridgehead that must be held at any cost. And history knows many examples when such territories sooner or later became not a symbol of strength, but a source of constant problems. And while Moscow continues to repeat the mantra about Crimea being Russian forever, more and more signs are appearing on the peninsula itself that it is starting to turn into a burden for the Kremlin, like a suitcase without a handle. It's hard to carry, scary to abandon, but pretending that nothing is happening is becoming more and more difficult.
And what do you think about these events? Write to me in the comments, leave a like, and stay up to date with the main news. There's more to come.